Welcome to this tutorial on thematic content analysis. I'm John Elfers, Director of the Dissertation Office, as well as Director of the Center for Innovation in Teaching and Learning. This tutorial came about because of my observation that many students are expected to conduct a thematic content analysis, but have very little experience doing so. It is one thing to read about the steps and read a description of the process, but this may not translate into an understanding of the sequence of steps in a thematic content analysis. And this is an important topic. For many Sofia students, conducting a thematic content analysis may be their primary mode of analysis for a dissertation or research study. So this tutorial is for you as a guide for analyzing data from interviews. My hope is that through this tutorial, you will come away feeling more confident that you can understand the purpose and the steps of the process. I will begin with some background material and then guide you through the steps of an analysis. First, I want to identify the sources for the material in this tutorial. I'm drawing from these sources as well as from personal experience in conducting analyses in many research studies. I encourage you to use these sources to read more and to get background into the philosophy and purpose of thematic content analysis. So here's where we're going in this tutorial. First, I'm going to provide some background on the logistics of making a transcript. Then we'll look at the process of identifying meaning units, and I will show you some examples of that. We'll look at the process of coding data, of analyzing data, and then organizing codes into categories and themes. Overall, textual analysis is a process for deriving meaning from words, but there are many approaches to textual analysis, and it's important to be clear about which one we're using here. Discourse, for instance, is one example of textual analysis, and it's focused on deconstructing language itself. Discourse analysis is based on social construction, meaning that it assumes that language and knowledge are socially constructed. So discourse analysis looks for what social patterns, political influences, epistemologies that are implicit in the language itself. It is frequently used in ethnographic studies. Narrative inquiry, on the other hand, focuses on story elements and themes that might emerge from data through stories. Memo coding is a record of a researcher's thoughts and process throughout the data collection, and that might come into a particular analysis in qualitative research. In thematic content analysis, language is a proxy for subjective experience. Our participants explore their personal experience on a topic and then try as best they can to put that experience into words. In much of qualitative research, we don't focus on the nature of the language itself so much as wanting to get behind the language, back to the profound subjective experience the participant is describing. The lived experience, the transformative experience, which is what most studies at Sofia University focus on. So this is the form of textual analysis that we will focus on in this tutorial, trying to get behind the language, back to the subjective experience of our participants. So let's talk first about transcribing an interview. Before we dive into the steps of analysis, it's important to know that you first have to have an interview in front of you. You will likely be making an audio recording of an interview. So the first step is to get that audio data onto paper, into a document that is a faithful transcript of the interview. There are several ways of doing this. One is to type it for yourself. In fact, I strongly encourage you to do this for at least a couple of interviews first, if you've never done it. Transcribing an interview yourself will be a valuable experience and help you attune to the subtleties of language and the back and forth of the interview. It means sitting down and listening and typing, making sure you're faithful to the audio recording. Transcribing a 1-hour interview may take as long as 4 or 5 hours or more, but it is well worth the effort to attune yourself to the process. There are a couple decisions you should make ahead of time before transcribing. Some schools of thought insist that a transcription be faithful to every sound on the recording. So every vocal misstep like and you know what I mean, and all those are included in the transcript. You can decide whether this is important to you or not. In general, with thematic content analysis, you're looking for meaningful data. And so it might be helpful to not include the ands and ums. They can be a distraction when reading. Another feature is indicating emotions in the transcript. So for some types of analysis, say discourse analysis or narrative analysis, the pauses and emotional indicators might be important to the transcript. Some researchers include these as they can be indicators of emotion and some of the more subtle experience that can inform the words on the page with more meaning. This is a decision you should make ahead of time, whether or not to include these. However, if you've conducted the interview, if you listen to the recording, that's why transcribing yourself can be key. You're listening to the recording and recalling where there was laughter, tears, pauses. So you can see here on the slide that pauses are indicated in brackets, often with the length of the pause, whether there's laughter or tears, all those are inserted in the transcript in brackets. So with thematic content analysis, the focus is really on the essential meaning. So use that in making a decision about the depth and detail of your transcription. Another decision to make is whether to include non-essential elements of the interview. If you begin an interview with a centering or a mindfulness to set the tone for the interview, you may not want to include that. Or if you engage in dialogue designed to, to build rapport with your interviewee and exchange pleasantries, you might choose to not transcribe those. Or you could just indicate with a sentence. The interview began with a discussion of the participant's recent illness and delay in setting up the interview, and leave it at that rather than transcribe the entire process. You also may begin an interview reviewing the informed consent and asking the participant if they have any questions about the informed consent. Actually, this is something that is highly recommended. But whether you choose to put that dialogue in the transcript is a decision that you make ahead of time. But what is essential is to get all of the data relevant to the topic of the research question on paper. There are other options besides transcribing yourself, though again, I strongly suggest that you do the first couple of those yourself to begin with. It's a good practice and will generate a lot of sensitivity to the process. So you can hire a transcriber if you use an online service or hire a transcriber. You want to make sure that you have a transcriber confidentiality agreement in place. And we have samples of those on the website for the dissertation office. You'll see a sample transcriber agreement. This is very important when it comes to confidentiality. If you use an online service, you want to make sure it's secure. It uses a coding process and indicates that it's HIPAA compliant. Online transcription services tend to be cheaper than other services. But regardless, I want to be very clear that if you use an online transcription service, you still have to listen to the audio recording and review that transcription to make sure that it's accurate. Online services and transcribers, they didn't conduct the interview. They may not know what some of the terms mean. They may transcribe them not accurately. So you want to be very, very careful and review the transcript with the audio recording. Still, that saves a little time from doing it yourself. One of the online services that I like to use is temi.com. So if you go to this link, temi.com, you can sign up, and this is an online digital process for transcribing, and Temi will transcribe an hour interview in about 3 or 4 minutes at a cost of maybe about $15. And you can just register online. It'll give you a transcript, and it can be very, very helpful and useful. That's the one that I use right now. I find it very worthwhile. I wanted to take a moment to just show you what a transcript might look like. So this is a transcript from an interview that I did. I'm going to be using this as an example to sort of walk through all the steps. And the interview transcripts and process that I'm using are from my own dissertation. So these are ones that I've already done. I have samples here that I can show you. So a couple of things I want to point out on my transcript is, first of all, I code each interview with a letter and number so that I know, and I know this is a primary interview. It's the initial interview. So this is really my pseudonym. I have a pseudonym for this person, but on the transcript, I just like to use numbers and letters to indicate some kind of indicator, and I will describe why in a little bit. And this is the primary interview. It's the first one that I've done. I may have a secondary interview later with this person. Then I put the date of the interview here. You'll notice that I have divided up here. So here's me speaking, my initials, and then I have the number of the person that I'm interviewing here. And if you choose, I mean, you could put, if you want to put more spaces between these to indicate them, that's fine. The other thing I want to point out is you will see line numbers here along the left. This I strongly recommend. It's very critical in keeping track of things. So I'm going to be extrapolating some data and meaning units out of my interview, and I want to be able to say, ooh, that quote came from interview C3, line 10. These are the breadcrumbs that I will use to indicate how I can get back, so I can go back to that quote in context. So that is very important. If you don't know how to insert line numbers, just go to Google and type in the version of Word that you have. So I type in Mac Word 2019, inserting line numbers, and type that in. Someone will show you how to do that process. So here are the steps to a thematic content analysis. I'm outlining them here to give you an overview. And then after this, I'm going to go through each one individually and give you a lot of examples. But I want you to see the overall process. So the first thing we do in a content analysis is identify meaning units. Then we take and we bring all the meaning units together in a separate document. We extrapolate them. So now we're just working with meaning units. Then we code each of these meaning units with a label. We put a name or a label to them in a coding process. Then we take all those codes and we begin to organize them into categories, and then organize the categories into themes. So you can see that the process involves increasing levels of abstraction. Content analysis is an art as much as a science, and it demands careful thought and attention at each step. Two people doing a thematic content analysis on the same document may come up with varying themes or even different themes. So it is important to let the data speak for themselves and try to listen to the data, pay attention to what is going on behind the words. This is critical to the process. So here I've taken the steps of thematic content analysis and just given you a visual. So I just want to point out some things. So this are the steps for conducting one interview. This is not a series of interviews. This is just how to approach one interview. Let's say it's your first one. The first thing you go through is you identify meaning units. Those are along here at the bottom. These are quotes, things that the person said that are relevant to the topic or the research question. So I identify those. And I go through that, and I do that for the whole interview. Then I take those meaning units and I begin to organize them with labels. I put labels on them or codes, and then I begin to organize the codes. So maybe I put these three meaning units. They all have the same label because they're referring to the same thing. Once all the coding is done, I begin to organize the codes into categories. Categories are descriptive labels. And then ultimately we take that to themes. Themes tend to be a little more interpretive, whereas categories are more descriptive. That's a way to think about them. Before showing you an example, I want to point out that you can think of a thematic content analysis in two ways. One is doing an analysis on each interview, a separate analysis on each interview. That's one way to think about it. So let's look at what that looks like. So each of these lines here, like right here, this line, this is an interview on one participant. And so there I've identified all the meaning units. That's the participant data. I've made codes for that interview. I put them into categories, and then I develop themes for that particular interview. And I go to the second interview and I do that again, the third, the fourth, the fifth, and so forth, all the way through. Doing a thematic content analysis completely on each separate person. Then at the end, I have all these themes from all the different interviews, and now I want to bring them together to get a sense of the whole. And here with the various themes, I'm looking at what is common across all my participants, as well as what also might be unique to those participants. There are some instances where it makes sense to conduct the analysis in this way. I did this with my dissertation. I developed themes at the individual level first with each interview. Then I went back and threw all of the meaning units from every interview into a big pot and started over at the beginning with a huge set of meaning units. Doing it this way helped me create more overarching themes that spanned all of my interviews. And in doing so, I found nuances that I would not have found otherwise. Either way, whichever way you go, it's important to make this decision ahead of time. So here if you look at the themes at the top, the themes here didn't come from comparing the themes of each individual interview. It came from doing another analysis of bringing all the data together, recoding, and putting them into categories across all of the 10 interviews, and then working with the themes. So let's begin to look at meaning units. The individual discrete units of data in thematic content analysis are called meaning units or data units. I prefer the term meaning units since the name indicates what it is, and it's a reminder to me of what I'm looking for. I'm looking for meaning, so I just prefer the term meaning units, and that's what I'll be using here. So in identifying meaning units, you're building from the bottom up. So this is an inductive approach. And so I encourage you to approach each interview with a beginner's mind, as if you're looking at this for the first time, trying to really be objective. In identifying meaning units, you're looking for discrete phrases or sentences. Units of the transcript that just convey one idea, not more than one idea, just one. And if you need to break up a sentence even into phrases, that is fine. It's good to just think in terms of one meaning unit at a time. Also, identifying meaning units depends on what you're looking for. If you're looking for lived experience, then that's what you're going to be searching in the document for, in the transcript. And you'll note anything that suggests, anything that's related to lived experience. If you're looking for interpersonal dynamics, you will note that. In many interviews at Sofia, students are really looking for lived experience, felt experience, somatic experience, and transformative experience. So just be aware that what you're looking for can really make a difference in how you go about identifying those meaning units. Okay, now let's look at a real-life interview. Going back to the one that I showed you before, this is the transcript, and this is from my dissertation. It was looking at transcendent sexual experiences. So that was the topic. Some of it was looking at lived experience, transformative experience, and integrative experience. So those were kind of the three areas that I was looking at. So let's go through. So what you've noticed here are highlights, and what these are, each highlight is a meaning unit. So I go through the transcript and I start reading, and I'm looking for meaning units. So here the person says, my parents were very conservative. They were not super religious. They wanted to make sure that I grew up in a church because that's what you did to keep kids safe. You raised them in a church. That was a family thing. Okay, that's starting to look at background, for someone's personal experience. So I have highlighted this. I haven't done the whole paragraph, you'll notice, because this next one seemed to be a different meaning unit to me. They were more about patriotism and civil religion than they were about religion as such. Okay, that's a qualification. I want to keep this separate. And any of the sexual taboos I had growing up were about, what will the neighbors think? What will the relatives think? Okay, so this seems to be a second meaning unit. So I go down further, I'm reading, and now here I identify another meaning unit. I was hearing in the news, I was hearing on the outside teenagers and college kids much older than me taking trips to India and things like that. So here's information coming from not the parents, but from the outside. I'm making this a meaning unit, just this. I have a little space in here you can see because I want this to be separate. Then here's another meaning unit. Sex was just about be a good girl so that people don't think you're a slut. It's all about what other people think and not being taken advantage of. It was all about shame. So to me, this kind of is a cohesive, discrete statement about messages or that this person experienced from the community and from family, both. So I keep going down. Here's one. My mother made it very clear that she didn't like sex. It was something the woman had to do. So that's one discrete unit. And then my dad was very different. He is very sexual, extremely good looking, model, beautiful. And I always related more to my dad than to my mom. So here I want to separate these two. I don't want to make this one paragraph a meaning unit because one relates to the mother or one kind of message, the father another. Again, so I'm taking it down to the most basic units I can. By the time I was 13, 14, she was giving it to me overtly. By that time, my experience with my body was so very different. I knew I couldn't relate to her. So this is really looking at sort of body experience. That's another meaning unit here. So as you see, I'm going through and I'm identifying meaning units throughout the whole transcript, and I'm doing that by highlighting them. Okay, so that's the first step. I would do this all the way through the entire transcript, just identifying anything that is in any way relevant. Okay, so I started with a blank document. And what I did is everything that I highlighted in my interview, I copy and pasted into another document. So now all I have are the meaning units for this particular interview. And I want to notice something. This is very important. Here I put the code for my interview, C3, and then I put the line number. I include that when I copy it out of there. I always want that line number with it and the indicator of the interview, so I can always go back. I can find it in context. So you really want to include these breadcrumbs right from the beginning. So when you copy and paste them out of there, if you include this, it will set you up. You'll always have them. So now we're going to go through the coding process. And coding is putting a label on to each individual meaning unit. So labels might be related, to actions or behaviors, attitudes, ideas, concepts, anything like that. But what I want to do is just try to start by just putting a label onto each one. So I look at this one. Okay, my parents were very conservative. They were not super religious. They wanted to make sure that I grew up in a church because that's what you did to keep things safe. Kids safe. You raised them in a church. That was a family thing. So I'm going to put up here parents and religion. That's the code. I want a descriptive code for these. Then down here, okay, and they were more about patriotism. I'm going to highlight this so I know it's a code and I can see it more easily. And they were more about patriotism and civil religion than they were about religion as such. Sexual taboos were about what will the neighbors think, what will the relatives think. So I'm going to label this parental attitudes around sex. Okay. So here it is, and I put a label on that one. So here, I was hearing in the news on the outside, teenagers, college kids much older than me, taking trips to India and things like that. I was hearing obliquely, but never knew anything about other religions at all. So here, I'm just going to call this political environment. Okay, so I'm coding this. You can see I'm looking at each one individually. What is a label for this code? Or for this meaning unit? What is the code for this? So this one, 6 was just about be a good girl so that people don't think you're a slut. It's all about what other people think, not being taken advantage of. This sounds like a sex message. Okay, that's what I'm going to put on this one, okay? Whoops. That's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to bold that. Sorry. Okay, there we go. All right, this one, my mother made it very clear that she didn't like sex. It was something a woman had to do. So this is going to be mother's attitude. There we go. All right. This one, father's attitude. And here, by the time I was 13, 14, my mother was giving it to me overtly. By that time, my experience with my body was very different. And I knew that I couldn't relate to her. So this is, body relationship with her body. So you can see what I'm doing here in these examples. I'm going through every meaning unit. I'm putting a code on, and as I go down, I'll start to see repeated codes. There'll be more codes related to her mother's attitudes, maybe some more about messages she received, more about the political environment. So I can use the same ones, but what I want to do is put a label on each individual meaning unit, and notice that I put everything, it's a different document now, so that all I'm working with now is meaning units that I'm coding, so that then I can organize those codes within the same document. So now what I'm showing you here is that same document, having gone through and coded every meaning unit within that interview. And then what I did is I took and I combined the codes, every code that related to, say, early messages. Or actually, I had some that were even before that, different kinds of messages from mother, from father, and I combined all of those into now what I called a theme. So early messages. So this is the theme of early messages, and all of the codes that relate to early messages I have put under here. So they're all organized together. One thing I want to point out is that you'll see my code here. That means I can always go back and find where it is in the original transcript so that I can see it in context if I need to do that. So these are the themes then that emerged by coding each unit and then cutting and pasting and organizing them and putting this with that one, beginning to organize it. So ultimately for this interview, this is what I came up with. These are the themes. So here I have a theme of early messages. There was a theme for this person on temple visions. It was very much a part of her experience. There was a theme on a nature connection. There was a theme called recognition and acceptance. There was a theme of mystical connection, a theme of community, a theme of crisis in her experience, a theme of integration, how she integrated those experiences, and then a theme of challenges, and one called bisensual. This was very much part of her experience. So what I want to point out is that now I have themes from this particular interview that now I can compare with my other interviews. Some will be similar, some will be different, but I have them organized. I also wanted to point out, I try to use words that are fairly descriptive so that by reading them, I know what's contained in here. Early messages. Try to only use a couple words, not long phrases. So just a very concise description of this particular theme and all the meaning units that are associated with that. Now that you've seen an example of the process of coding into categories and themes, just want to say a few words about this. And that's that textual analysis is a creative process. You may have someone else, do it and they come up with something something different. So we're really trying to extrapolate and create meaning out of these words, and the meaning relates to someone's profound subjective experience. So coding is the process of identifying categories and meanings in text, applying a name or code to each so we can begin to make sense of it, and then systematically organizing them, putting them in combinations so that we come up with a theme, which may have several categories underneath, and a theme is a little larger level of abstraction. Here's a quote that I like, I just want to share. It's from Polkinghorne. One of the difficult aspects of the data analysis process to explain is the transformation of a meaning unit, which is given in a subject's everyday language, into a statement using psychological terms to describe the phenomena being investigated. I love this quote. This summarizes so much for me. And now that you've seen an example, I think maybe you can appreciate it more. Taking that subjective experience of language and putting it into psychological terms that are descriptive. A couple things about the actual names. So creating categories and themes, the names can come from one that I apply as the researcher, from things that the participants have said. This is called an in vivo term, which means it literally comes from the participant themselves, or from the literature. If I know I want to tie into the literature and there are some terms that tie into theories in literature, I want to use that. It also helps if code names are meaningful, and so that when you look at them and read them, they're what I think of as face valid, maybe. They really describe, the term describes what is in there. And just in terms of one distinction, when you're first coding, you're being descriptive. By the time you get to themes, you've had a level of interpretation in there. So themes tend to be more interpretive in their orientation. I want to spend a few minutes now talking about the next important step, and that's after having conducted, say, 10 interviews, how do I bring the themes together in a meaningful way? And this kind of came out of looking at the themes from each individual interview in my study, but also pulling all the data back together. I put all the meaning units together and started to recode them and combine them in different ways so that I developed themes that came out of all 10 interviews. And some of these related to themes that were in their individual interviews, but some, like Adam here, he had some that are not in here. They were peculiar to him, but these were the ones that were common to everyone. So this was an important step. So I want to point out you can see what I did here. I created a spreadsheet, and I can't imagine bringing themes together without doing this. I brought together all of the meaning units from each interview, and you see I have them coded here. This was A1, line 25. And all of these relate to the theme of awakening. Awakening was a really big theme across all of my interviews, and it was the idea of awakening to the transcendent nature of sexuality. So you can see here, and this is just one, these are just 3 of the interviews. So I have 3 sheets with 3 or 4 interviews on each one. So you can see I have all of the data together. And so what this allows me to do is that when I go to write up the findings about awakening, I have everything right in front of me. I can use quote, I have my quotes right here, and I can look and I can kind of compare and bring all this together. It's really helpful for me in being able to write up the findings rather than keep sifting back through all these interviews. What did that person say? I brought it all together in a kind of spreadsheet using a Word document like this, using a table. Here what I have is a spreadsheet for another theme. This was the theme of challenges related to transcendent sexual experiences. In this sheet, you notice this person didn't identify any. So not everyone did, but I would say, 80 or 90% of participants had something related to challenges. Here, Jeremy had a challenge related to shame. One here, Emma had one related to crisis. And so as I look down, I have all of the data that relates to challenges in the various spreadsheets related to this theme. So when it comes time to write this up, I have the data right here. I also, again, have my breadcrumbs. It takes me right back to where I can find that in the original transcript if I need to do that. So now on this slide, you will see the 11 themes that emerged out of all of my interviews. And you can see the process I went through. Doing each one individually, identifying meaning units, coding, all that, all the way working up, then bringing all the data together, comparing themes across all participants. And this is what was common to all of them. And I named them acceptance, awakening, blissful, challenges. I mean, you can read them. So this was kind of the sum total of the themes. And it was a process to get here, but I want you to appreciate how each step was important. So let's go back. I think it's worth going over it again, just in review. This is what we did. So these are the steps in doing a thematic content analysis on one interview, starting with those meaning units, highlighting them in the transcript, copying them all into another page with their identifiers, and then starting to reorganize them. Once I have them all and I've coded them, I can start putting things that are like together and start organizing them. Oh, these two kind of go together. Let's put them here. Maybe I change the name. I start to organize them, and then I start putting them into categories that make sense, descriptive categories. And then from there, I might combine categories or make that category into a theme that is more interpretive, just with that term. So that's for one interview. And then here again, this is doing several interviews. Each one of these lines, these vertical lines, is a separate interview. And then at the top, bringing the themes across all the interviews together. And you can do that by combining the themes of the individual interviews, or going back to the basic data, putting it all together in one document, and do another coding of it and look at what might sift out if I'm coding my meaning units across all of the interviews. So that's the process. So that's by way of review. The final thing I wanted to talk about is that what I've described here is the process you would do in thematic content analysis manually. I strongly encourage you to do the first few times, do it manually this way. There are computer-assisted qualitative data analysis programs. They're called QDA, Qualitative Data Analysis. That's the acronym. Software available. These are some of the major ones that are available: Max QDA, QDA Minor, In Vivo, Atlas, and Deduce. Now, I'm going to give you an example of one, but I want to point out these don't do the analysis for you. They help with the organization, and they can help actually with organizing the findings. So there really are some advantages to using these, but you still have to identify the discrete meaning units. It doesn't do that for you. You still have to code them, and you still have to organize the code. So you still have to do a lot of the work, but these computer-assisted QDAs can really help with the organization of all of your data. So here I want to give you an example of what Deduce looks like. This is a project I'm currently working on with a colleague here. And so this is our media. So here's our transcripts that are in here. at this point, and you'll notice we've had to go in and code them. When you code them, it puts a color to them. And over here is on the right are the codes. So this is called cultural awareness of the supervisor. And here's the exact excerpt. Notice I have little discrete meaning units here all the way through. Down here, you can see the list of all the codes that have been identified so far across all of the interviews. So you still have to work through the process. That's one of the points I really want to make, is you still have to do this. But some of the things that this can do here, so if I'm looking at, I think is maybe under descriptive charts, I can look at, let's see, what's it going to do for me here? No, maybe that's not what I want to do. Oh, let me look at code charts here. So different ways it can organize the codes and show how frequently they appear. It can put them in different forms. There's a nice 3D code cloud, and it will produce charts based on each individual interview, or based upon the types of themes. So it's an example. There's a lot more in here. I will say, you do have to put some work into learning the program. So if you're only doing a few interviews, it may not be worth it. Maybe if you're doing more than 12 or 15, maybe it becomes worth it to do that. But if you're just doing a few, I wouldn't necessarily jump into this, into a QDA, unless you're really going to be doing a lot of them. So in closing then, I just want to say that we have many resources at the Dissertation Office and the Center for Innovation in Teaching and Learning. Feel free to take advantage of those. Feel free to share this tutorial with other people, or let them know that it's here. This is really meant to be useful for you. So thank you very much, and I look forward to working with you in the future.